This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, one of the world's leading international professional bodies, which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide.
I'm one of your hosts, Christian van Nieuwerburgh, Professor of Coaching and Positive Psychology at the Center for Positive Health Sciences at RCSI, and I'm very interested in the integration of coaching and positive psychology.
And I'm Paula Nacif, Wellbeing Coach and Researcher and Senior Lecturer at the Masters of Positive Psychology and Coaching Psychology at the University of East London.
We are delighted to bring you this 7-part series exploring the similarities and differences between coaching for well-being and health coaching.
These terms are often used interchangeably, but this series suggests they represent very distinct practices.
We have lined up some incredible guests who share their insights, ideas, and experiences in health and well-being contexts.
We aim to provide answers and understanding on this fascinating and important area of coaching and many more questions. Our guest today is Dr. Lizana Oberholzer. She is chair of the British Psychological Society's Division of Coaching Psychology, and she currently works at the School of Education at the University of Wolverhampton. Lizana is passionate about teacher development. She's also an accomplished researcher with interest in professional learning, mentoring, coaching and leadership development within education. She does research in mentoring, coaching for school leaders and early career teachers, leadership in education, and teacher education. Welcome, Lizana. Thank you for being here.
Welcome so much, Lizana. We're so delighted to have you on this podcast. Anna and I are co-hosting a series of podcasts about health and well-being. And this opportunity to hear from you, especially in your role in the Division of Coaching Psychology, is something we've been really looking forward to.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Christian. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to speaking to you both on the various topics we are aiming to explore today.
Lizana, just to kick us off, Anna and I have been talking to guests about the similarities and differences between coaching for health and coaching for well-being. So when you hear that, what is your first kind of response to how the Division of Coaching Psychology would see coaching for health and coaching for well-being?
It's a really interesting question. And I think it's to do with the purpose of what we, align our intervention for. Coaching for well-being, the way I would probably define that is that, because I haven't really fully introduced myself, but as a coaching psychologist and someone who works within the space, I'm also working within education. So one of my roles is to work with teachers in particular. And as we know, their roles are particularly challenging and workload is often difficult. And well-being is often the forefront of our thinking when we think about how they balance things and how they work through that. And I think I often feel that the role of coaching psychology and coaching in particular can be something to consider as part of their well-being toolkit, which enables them to have a space and place where it helps them to make sense of their landscape, the situation they're in, and also then to think about positive ways forward to address that and move that forward. So it's that constant engagement with your self-awareness, your way of being, and the way that you connect with yourself and also thinking through things. And I think that's what coaching psychology and coaching offers, is that opportunity to consider your well-being and have that as a agenda point and a priority to hold up and to use of that space to really think it through. And then coaching for health, again, I think that emphasis could be really depending on what you would like to achieve within the coaching conversation and that coaching session, depending on where you are within your own space and place. And you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Christian, but focusing on particular issues in terms of your health to move forward. Because I think a coaching psychologist and a coach can't diagnose, but we can help someone to think through certain challenges to enable them to find solutions and move things forward, to have a healthier way of being and enable them to cope with challenges as well.
Thank you. That's really interesting, Lizana. And we, in previous recordings and conversations we've had, we explored the kind of world of these definitions and how coaches' roles might be different in those different arenas. So when we think about health, one of the things we've discussed in the past is the role of coaching in supporting people with long-term medical conditions that might be physical or mental health long-term conditions in a more potentially medicalized setting or primary care setting if you are in the UK, or in other spaces if you are outside the UK, where people are seeking support to improve their health in a very specific way. And also, Christian, I think I invite you, Christian, to tell Liz a little bit more about coaching for positive health. That's another thing we've been talking about, we get really excited about, and it gives us a slightly different dimension to the work that we do as coaches.
Absolutely. And I think in essence, we're saying the same thing. When we think about coaching for health, it's very much about, depending on where someone is in terms of their own health, how they can utilize coaching and coaching psychology as an intervention to help them to cope with the situation they're in, or to think about how can they move their situation forward and find positive ways to address that with the help of that framed conversation we often have with colleagues or with those in our care that we look after.
And Lizana, you know that you and I share a particular passion about coaching in education as well. So I'd like to come back to that. And I agree, there's no diagnosis. I don't think diagnosis is the role of a coach. But as we're all saying here, coaching is about helping people to make progress on something that's important to them. And I think if it's about health, we're arguing that coaches can support people to make health-related improvements. Now, I think where we're getting to is that in order to be talking to people about their health, the coach has to have a background and understanding in health. But I also love the idea that you were saying, Lizana, is all coaching conversations actually may have a well-being effect. In other words, coaching conversations are good for well-being. So that's another angle. So in your experience within education, how are you seeing coaching being used to support the well-being of educators, students, and leaders?
I think the first thing I would say in education in particular is that coaching is obviously starting to gain a lot more traction, and it's perceived to be a really important intervention that we can use within educational contexts, and in particular in schools where we think about professional learning. But what we are also seeing is that it can be utilized to enable people to, as I've said, make sense of their world, often thinking very carefully about workload in particular that might affect well-being, and talk through the challenges of workloads, thinking about the current situation, what's the ideal state we want to be in, and then starting to map where we would like to be and moving towards that. And also, of course, mindset, because I think, Christine, you and I had a really interesting conversation earlier on in the year as well around this whole issue of what happens within education, because this is a lot more performative as a landscape. So there's a different demand on teachers in terms of how they are made to feel sometimes, or even school leaders. And sometimes it's then enabling those colleagues to feel that they still have the autonomy to become creative. There's a relatedness there, and they can map it out to enable them to move forward with things. Whereas, very often there's a deficit model where people feel that coaching and mentoring is just used when someone is in a difficult situation or when they're in trouble. And I think we need to change that narrative where we want coaching and mentoring, and in particular coaching, to be perceived as, an intervention that can really help to shape thinking, help people to find solutions for the workload and well-being challenges they are in, but also to help them to prioritize their well-being and to know when to seek help, and that it's not an issue to seek help, but actually it is a very normal thing to do. Sometimes I think because it's been used as a deficit model or as a negative connotation being linked to it, in some contexts, people are reluctant to take it up or look at it as a way to help them to unpack things and to find a well-being solution for themselves.
That's beautiful. And I agree. I think at some point it was seen as remedial, wasn't it? As what you need as a coach. But I think there's something very rich in what you said about the culture in schools, performative and getting results. Is there a risk that sometimes coaching can be detrimental to the well-being of educators if coaching is used as a way really only to focus on performance goals?
I do think so. We are delighted, and I want to emphasize that in 2019, the Department for Education highlighted that coaching is one of those really important interventions that we need to use to help with teacher retention. But with that came then some misconceptions around different types of coaching, in particular, as you know, Jim Knight's model, which is often referred to as a directive approach to coaching, where we are really looking at telling people what to do rather than, in the true spirit of coaching, where we are looking at the coachee being in the driving seat with a non-judgmental conversation and enabling that person to find those solutions for themselves. So I think that sometimes when it gets construed within government policy, that could sometimes be a challenge and a problem. But as you know, Professor Rachel Loftus did a lot of advocacy work around that to rectify the perception on what it is. But I think there are still some strange and interesting interpretations of what coaching can and should do. And I think that it's an ongoing conversation to demonstrate how coaching can actually have a profound positive impact and not be highly performative in itself, but actually enabling others to have autonomy and creativity.
Thank you, Lizana. This is really interesting in terms of changing potentially a paradigm in the education system and where it comes from, this more performative space. What comes to my mind is if coaching is used as we are all talking about, as it intended, as a support, a developmental and a growth mechanism for teachers, what is the impact in the school community? And I'm thinking about the well-being beyond the individual teachers and the school leaders, the children, the students, the community, parents, and that real impact that's more a collective impact of the work that we do.
That's a really good question, Anna. And some of my work that I've done is working with school children to develop them as peer listeners for others, where we then draw on coaching principles to enable them to then support younger children within the school who don't feel that they can speak to adults necessarily for whatever reason. So that is where we see really profound and powerful impacts, where coaching conversations can really help us to frame the conversation well, create a safe space, help the young person to feel that they can connect and relate to that older student that they can work with, and really develop their thinking and finding solutions for themselves, and also learning how to self-coach and self-regulate. So I do think, there are different ways that we can use this intervention that we're also passionate about to really help people from an early age of onwards to really find ways forward. And for me, what's really interesting then is how those learning conversations then spills over into then how young people communicate and develop their soft skills with their friends as well. I think one of the loveliest things I've ever heard was when I was working with a leadership team in the school, where we were looking at coaching and coaching cultures within the school. And the head teacher spoke to me and said, this coaching thing you're trying to teach us about and the coaching psychology that underpins it, I think it's making me a better person. And I think that the children will benefit from that as well, because we really listen to each other. There's that sense of valuing that other person, connecting and really listening to understand rather than listening with an answer in mind. And I think with that peer listening project that I've worked with, that was one of the most important things that came out of that, is that listening for understanding and enabling someone to have a real sense of belonging within a context where they can then flourish. And I think that's key.
That is beautiful, Lizana. And thank you for all the work you've been doing in this field. Those are the beautiful stories we love to hear when people say things like that. I think it allows me to be a better person, a better communicator. And thinking about the ripple effect across school communities is just amazing. So thank you for your work in this space.
That's really kind of you to say, Christian. And I think that the powerful thing about coaching and coaching psychology is that it's co-constructive. We learn as much from those we work with as they do from us. And I think that's why the work is so important, because we do create those communities of connection. And the more we can actually have communities who fully, as you often say, I listen to a lot of your recordings, Christian, and you often talk about being in the moment with someone and learning to be in the moment with someone really makes a profound difference rather than rushing around them. And I think more of that's needed in schools where things are so fast paced and we often forget ourselves.
Yeah. So really, well-being is central in so many ways, isn't it, Lizana? Because for our leaders to perform at their best, and our educators and our students, they need to be experiencing well-being. And a lot of these interventions are also about well-being. And this is one of the reasons I love the idea of positive psychology coaching, because my argument for that is it's coaching, but well-being is embedded in the intervention, which is exactly what you're saying. I just want to go back to instructional coaching, if I might, Lizana, because I do think, especially in the UK, sometimes that intervention has been misunderstood or misapplied. And very good colleagues and friends with Dr. Jim Knight, so we have a lot of opportunities to talk about this. And I know that he's also disappointed that it's been misinterpreted in a particular way. But this leads me to another question. So according to Jim and myself, and we've written something about this, we see coaching as being either fully facilitative or dialogical, where the coach might share information but still not tell people what to do. It's still not directive. So we see facilitative and dialogic coaching as two partnership approaches, and instructional coaching is a dialogic approach. And that's the approach we're using in the health sector as well, because I teach at the University of Medicine and Health Sciences, and health professionals have said, well, sometimes we need to share information. But this idea of not prescribing is kind of central for me for it to be called coaching. So with your division of coaching psychology hat on, what is your take on sharing information?
It's always a good question. And I think just coming back to the misconstruction of what instructional coaching is, I think that it stems from the name itself, instruction. And of course, in an American context, instruction means teaching and learning. So how do we develop teaching and learning through coaching? Whereas in the UK context, it's been understood at the time as telling people what to do. As a directive.
Yeah.
And of course, that's never been the intent. It's always been the intent to really help people in learning conversations, to think through how they can find solutions to be the best they can be in the classroom. So in essence, that's really where I think the whole issue lies. And of course, it was very difficult for us to challenge and think through. But again, thinking about it through a coaching psychology lens, thinking through it as a coach, coaching conversations are non-directive. But as you rightfully say, is that there is a continuum. Sometimes someone is stuck within a conversation. Sometimes they're stuck with their thinking. And again, we've all been trained as coaching psychologists and coaches where we can ask permission, can I offer observation, can I offer a suggestion? The coachee can reject that, but they can also, the rejection could also lead to greater insights, because they'll say, no, this is not what I mean, but actually I mean this, which will help them to unlock their thinking. Similarly, if it's a really helpful suggestion, it can help them to progress that and move it on. At no point do we enforce anything. And I particularly like Jim's book on better conversations, where he really explains this very well.
Yes.
And he advocates for us all to have better conversations. And I think there's nothing wrong with enabling someone's thinking, and that might manifest in different ways. I think the key is just to ask permission and to then circle back to remaining curious and really holding our coaching practices and habits and principles high. And of course, the ethical side of that as well, not to influence someone's thinking with your own view and driving the direction. It's always their direction of travel.
Thank you for that. It's very helpful to think about things in a more flexible way, isn't it? And thinking about the client at the heart of our conversations. And one thing that comes to my mind is that depending on our backgrounds, and of course coaches come from all walks of life, we may have some knowledge. So we think about health, well-being. Coaching psychologists might have knowledge of different ways and models of working. And so what questions do you think coaches need to ask themselves about their own practice and their scope of practice and skills they might need to develop and so on, to be able to be in that space and make choices that are helpful for clients?
It's a really good question, Anna. I'm currently teaching a module on coaching on the master's course I work on, and I work with teachers who are developing as coaches. And I think one of the things they find the hardest to do, if they are knowledgeable within the field, is to sit on their hands, in a sense, to give advice because they think they know the answer. And we've had a really interesting conversation last week where I said, well, the answer is often right for you, but is that the right answer for the client or for the coachee? Because they might have a different lens or a different take. And I think something we always have to internalize and remind ourselves of is to watch ourselves in terms of, are we holding that person central in the conversation? Are we driving their agenda, or whose agenda are we driving now? And if you are someone who, especially within the context I work in, we might have a sponsor that could be a school, could be a multi-academy trust. And of course, they are the fee-paying client, but our client is the person in front of us. So it's really important not to drive the wrong agenda and to always hold the person in front of you at the center of the focus. And it's always their direction of travel. And regardless of how much knowledge you hold, it is not necessarily right for the client to have the solution you might have in mind. It might be something else that they might want to pursue. I think it's about putting your ego slightly in the box and work with the client and be in the moment with them. And I think that's key, and that ethical requirement of us to really be true to that conversation and also not to collude with the client. I think, Christine, you say that in your book very clearly, is that appropriate challenge that we need to have in place for the client to really stretch their thinking, to make sure that we've explored all possibilities, to make sure we're in the right space and place for them.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lizana. It's so wonderful to reconnect to what is coaching all about. As I was listening to you, Lizana, I was thinking some clear principles emerging. And all of these principles are about what's best for the client. And we can't separate that from their health and well-being. It becomes so clear when you express it in that way. If we're there for the And then it is complex in organizations where maybe organizational pressures, organizational expectations seem to be putting health and well-being at risk. So from your own professional experience over the decades, where do you see coaching heading in relation to health and well-being?
For me, and just looking at how the field is evolving, and I know, Anna, we haven't even touched on your work that you're doing in terms of group coaching and leadership development, etc. I think that coaching and coaching psychology needs to play a profound role in the space in terms of education, but also business, health. There's such a wide spectrum where it can really influence, impact, and enable people. So first of all, the frontline individual that we work with, but also making colleagues aware of the value of what it brings to the table. I've been speaking to the students. I've been asked to touch base with the University of Coventry and also BCU students on coaching psychology. And one of the questions they asked me was, what's the point of coaching psychology? And I explained that actually, not only does it provide us with a really helpful space to make sense of the world around us, find positive solutions, but also it could develop leadership, it could develop spaces for well-being, sense of belonging and safety to enable us to find solutions. And as we've said earlier on in the talk, also that space in health where we can work within organizations or outside, depending on what your condition is, to help those colleagues or those people to cope with that. I think that, similar to counseling, we could also lobby for coaching psychology and its role it can play as an intervention that can be prescribed for people to then engage with via the NHS to help them cope with their challenges in regards to well-being and mental health and all sorts of other challenges they are facing. So it's got a developmental role, but also a support role and a role that it can play to help people to really just cope with the challenges they face within modern society as well.
Thank you, Lizana. That is one of my dreams, that coaching is seen as an intervention as part of the preventative agenda for health and social care across the country and beyond, and the world, where coaching comes in as helping people to live better lives and look after themselves and their health, well-being, and whatever they wish for themselves. Another thing that came to my mind when you're talking about the kind of our role, coaching psychologists, and in terms of leadership, and sometimes you work with organizations, and schools might be the case, universities, and where there is this real tension between systemic demands and individual capacity and other complexities. These are very highly complex environments. Do you think that as coaches, if you're working with leaders, you then perhaps use that analogy of holding the mirror up and also explore our individual responsibilities, not just for ourselves, but for others? Because sometimes we talk about the system as something that's done out there, but we're all responsible in some shape or form, especially if we have some power and authority within organizations. So what are your thoughts around that?
I think it's a really important point to make, Anna. I think it is about holding the mirror up, but it's also about leaders being values driven. And sometimes holding that mirror up makes them realize how far removed they are sometimes from their own values and what's important to them. And also then leading with that value system and that underpinning of their core values in the way that will enable others. So I think the coach's role and the coaching psychologist's role is profoundly important there to help leaders to be true to themselves, come back to the center, and really also, as I've said, in particular with the pandemic, I remember when I was coaching head teachers at the time, things were happening so fast and furious for them in terms of policy directives, things they had to do. And my role was basically a sounding board to help them to, first of all, understand policy and then to make sense of it, then thinking through strategically how will they share that with their teams, and also thinking about who would be affected the most in terms of the different groups and communities, etc. So that's an example where my role was very much a sense-making role. And sometimes when I work with new leaders, I find that it's also then getting them to know, A, what is their role and how do they need to work with their teams? And then from that, who is the leader they want to be in terms of what underpins their values and what's the values of the organization? How do they marry that up and make sure that that moves on in a way that they can see that they can make a huge difference? So I think it depends on who you work with. But as you say, we're part of a bigger system, but we're also within that system. And within the system, we can make a massive difference. And the coach in the coaching psychologist role there is really pivotal in that sense-making process.
Thank you, Lizana. Just on behalf of our listeners, I think our listeners are coaches who are interested in health and well-being. What advice would you have? And I know, advice isn't really our game, but if we were to give advice, what advice would you give for a coach who wants to either work in the well-being arena or, for example, wants to contribute in education? What sort of things can they do to start being able to do work in those areas?
It's a really interesting question, Christine. I think sometimes within education, if you would like to become a coach, certainly my pathway was, I first was approached to see whether I was interested in developing colleagues and see if I would want to work with colleagues. And that to me became very appealing and exciting, which then enabled me to become more curious and find out more about coaching and how coaching psychology worked and how that could be used to not only develop teachers, because the thing is, when you develop teachers, you also become part of the conversation regarding well-being, inevitably because of the workload challenge. And that in itself is important. And I think that, there's a lot being done centrally by government to also now have wellbeing champions in schools and so on. So if you're interested in education, you would probably want to go and speak to a wellbeing champion. Often it happens in that way, slightly more informally, and offer your services and make people aware of the fact that you're interested in that pathway. You might have already developed as a coach. So if you're someone who wants to do it as a role outside of a school, it might be that you'll want to get in touch with the school themselves and offer your services in that way. So many different angles into this, but generally speaking, it often starts with how do we develop others? I don't just work in schools, I also work in universities and sometimes I work outside of my field in business. And very often because of the work I do or because of the conversations I have, I'm approached to then pick up in a particular space or area of expertise, but that spills into then well-being. It is very interesting that in most work situations, there is a well-being concern or a well-being element. And I think it's also explaining to others how coaching psychology or how coaching can help as an intervention, but also as part of the toolkit we can offer to support with well-being and well-being conversations. So I think it very much depends on what situation you find yourself in, but it's also about segueing into the conversation that this is potentially what coaching psychology or coaching can offer.
From that, I'm also thinking about coaching is a kind of facilitative way of working. And I've known Christian for a very long time. I've been knowing you for a very long time. And I also know that many of all of us on the call have very specific interests in terms of our learning and development. So we did go and learned about coaching psychology or positive psychology or psychology itself. And I'm thinking about what is the role of that specialist knowledge? Because I get asked that all the time for students, like we're not doing anything in terms of the sharing of the knowledge, but I'm thinking about our role perhaps beyond the coaching room. As you're saying, you go to organizations, you're engaging with people. So how important is in health and well-being to have perhaps a more in-depth knowledge of the subject itself? And it's a huge subject, so there are many entry points for people.
I think for me, a lot of what I do is very integrated. And I was just casting my mind back, Anna, because you and I met each other at the University of East London as well. And even there, I was delivering on the MA in educational leadership. And there I had a module focusing on well-being and health within education. And I combined that with coaching and coaching psychology. So for me, it is a very deliberate thing, because I know that if teachers and educators and people in higher education, because we know workload is excessive there as well, are not looking after themselves and don't know how to actually approach people with the interventions they require to help them, to enable them, then, we will be in a position where things are becoming very difficult. And as you rightfully say, we want to have a preventative intervention rather than something that we need to grapple with when it's a problem. So it's really that creation of awareness through then our own research, our own conversations we keep having with others. As you can hear, I reach out to a lot of universities to talk about this work as well. And I think it's about continuing with these conversations to help people to understand what the role can be of coaching psychology and coaching in these different spaces. I think it's interweaving it into the fabric of the conversation. And I think it's Johnny Atterley who has written a book on putting staff first, and it's focusing on school teachers in particular. But in that book, he talks about having a wellbeing charter in organizations. I love the idea of having a charter. This is how we approach well-being, and well-being is also then on every agenda for every meeting we have. How will what we do affect what will happen to people's well-being? And I think that if we don't champion well-being through everything we do, and as a coaching psychologist and a coach, I feel a responsibility to also put people's well-being first. And I do make sure I ask, what do you need to give up if you choose certain things? How do you consider your own well-being? And I think you could integrate that into your work, but also in the conversations you have more broadly in a wider platform, as we are having today as well, and other spaces like education or wherever you might find yourself, you can champion that too.
Thank you, Lizana. This seems like a good spot to kind of start to wind down. And you've been doing this role of championing today. So this is wonderful. Thinking again, just to wrap up for our listeners, my question to you is, what sort of things do you do for your own well-being? Because I know a lot of your work is about supporting the well-being of others through coaching. And so just so we can give some ideas to our listeners, what sort of practical things do you do to look after your own well-being, Lizana?
People always ask me that, Christian. For me, I have an amazing dog. I've heard this morning Anna's dog is really interesting as well. I have to walk Max at least 4 times a day to keep him busy. He's a spaniel, so he's a very busy dog. In addition to that, I also swim. I swim at least 5 times a week. I also do mindfulness exercises, so I try to do that 10 minutes a day just to really center myself. I also have an effective journal at the end of the day where I have really enjoyed. I've just mentioned I've worked at the University of East London. One of the highlights of my life was to engage with the UEL's positive psychology course, in which I have learned about gratitude. So I tend to write down 3 things I think went well in the day, and I celebrate that because I feel it really helps me to remain positive and remain focused and centered. And I think it's important to look after yourself, but that also gives you the opportunity to be a good role model for other people, to say, well, look, this is what I do, and I make a conscious effort to do that. We are all very busy, but it's also important to find moments where we are still and where we also enjoy life as well. And I know, Kristen, you enjoy motorcycling. been watching on LinkedIn about your endeavors and what you're up to. And I think, Anna, I'm not always sure, but I think you've got a dog, children, and all sorts happening for you as well. And I think we all spend many plates.
Yeah, as I had a Me Too listening moment, when you're listening to someone, yes, me too. I love my dog. I love going for walks. Yeah. And that's such a happy moment. I love dogs, so I can totally relate. It's really good for your health and well-being.
I love dogs as well. And I feel, Lizana, thank you. I'm just so grateful to you for sharing these insights. And I do love the idea that one of the ways that we, each of us and the listeners, one of the ways we can champion this is to role model being intentional about our well-being. So on behalf of myself and Anna and the Association for Coaching, thank you so much for your wonderful insights today. We've loved having you here and hearing from you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lizana. It was a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching.
For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organizations, and society.
To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com.
Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events for your continuing professional development.